What is theory? What is theory? Let us begin with what theory is not. What theory is not. This presentation describes differences between papers that contain some theory rather than no theory. There is little agreement about what constitutes strong versus weak theory in the social sciences, but there is more consensus that references, data, variables, diagrams, and hypotheses are not theory. Despite this consensus, however, authors routinely use these 5 elements in lieu of theory. We explain how each of these 5 elements can be confused with theory and how to avoid such confusion. By making this consensus explicit, we hope to help authors avoid some of the most common and easily averted problems that lead readers to view papers as having inadequate theory. We then discuss how journals might facilitate the publication of stronger theory. We suggest that if the field is serious about producing stronger theory, journals need to reconsider their empirical requirements. We argue that journals ought to be more receptive to papers that test part rather than all of a theory and use illustrative rather than definitive data. The authors, reviewers, readers, and editors who shape what is published in ASQ insist, perhaps above all else, that articles contain strong organizational theory. ASQ's notice to contributors states, if manuscripts contain no theory, their value is suspect. A primary reason, sometimes the primary reason, that reviewers and editors decide not to publish a submitted paper is that it contains inadequate theory. This paper draws on our editorial experiences at ASQ and research in organizational behavior, ROB, to identify some common reasons why papers are viewed as having weak theory. Authors who wish to write strong theory might start by reading the diverse literature that seeks to define theory and distinguish weak from strong theory. The Academy of Management Review published a forum on theory building in October 1989. Detailed descriptions of what theory is and the distinctions between strong and weak theory in the social sciences can be found, for example, in Dubin's 1976 Analysis of Theory Building in Applied Areas, Friese's 1980 Review of Formal Theorizing, Kaplan's 1964 Philosophical Inquiry into the Behavioral Sciences, Mertens, 1967, Writings on Theoretical Sociology, and Wicks, 1989, Ideas about Theory Construction as Disciplined Imagination. Unfortunately, the literature on theory building can leave a reader more rather than less confused about how to write a paper that contains strong theory, Fries, 1980. There is lack of agreement about whether a model and a theory can be distinguished, whether a typology is properly labeled a theory or not, whether the strength of a theory depends on how interesting it is, and whether falsifiability is a prerequisite for the very existence of a theory. As Merton 1967, 39, put it, like so many words that are bandied about, the word theory threatens to become meaningless. Because its referents are so diverse, including everything from minor working hypotheses through comprehensive but vague and unaided speculations, to axiomatic systems of thought, use of the word often obscures rather than creates understanding. Lack of consensus on exactly what theory is may explain why it is so difficult to develop strong theory in the behavioral sciences. Reviewers, editors, and other audiences may hold inconsistent beliefs about what constitutes theory and what constitutes strong versus weak theory. Aspiring organizational theorists face further obstacles because there is little consensus about which theoretical perspectives and associated jargon are best suited for describing organizations and their members. Pfeffer, 1993. Even when a paper contains a well-articulated theory that fits the data, editors or reviewers may reject it or insist the theory be replaced simply because it clashes with their particular conceptual tastes. Finally, the process of building theory is itself full of internal conflicts and contradictions. Organizational scholars, like those in other social science fields, are forced to make trade-offs between generality, simplicity, and accuracy. Wick, 1979, and are challenged by having to write logically consistent and integrated arguments. These difficulties may help explain why organizational research journals have such high rejection rates. Writing strong theory is time-consuming and fraught with trial and error for even the most skilled organizational scholars. This is also why there is such great appreciation for those few people, like James March, Jeffrey Pfeffer, and Carl Wick, who are able to do it consistently. We don't have any magic ideas about how to construct important organizational theory. We will not present a set of algorithms or logical steps for building strong theory. The aim of this essay is more modest. We explain why some papers, or parts of papers, are viewed as containing no theory at all rather than containing some theory. Though there is conflict about what theory is and should be, there is more consensus about what theory is not. We consider 5 features of a scholarly article that, while important in their own right, do not constitute theory. Reviewers and editors seem to agree, albeit implicitly, that these 5 features should not be construed as part of the theoretical argument. By making this consensus explicit, we hope to help authors avoid some of the most frequent reasons that their manuscripts are viewed as having inadequate theory. Parts of an article that are not theory. 1. References are not theory. References to theory developed in prior work help set the stage for new conceptual arguments. Authors need to acknowledge the stream of logic on which they are drawing and to which they are contributing. But listing references to existing theories and mentioning the names of such theories is not the same as explicating the causal logic they contain. To illustrate, this sentence from Sutton's 1991, 262 article on bill collectors contains 3 references but no theory. This pattern is consistent with findings that aggression provokes the fight response, Frieda, 1986, and that anger is a contagious emotion, Shatter and Singer, 1962, Barron 1977. This sentence lists publications that contain conceptual arguments, and some findings. But there is no theory because no logic is presented to explain why. Aggression provokes fight, or why anger is contagious. Calls for more theory by reviewers and editors are often met with a flurry of citations. Rather than presenting more detailed and compelling arguments, authors may list the names of prevailing theories or schools of thought, without even providing an explanation of why the theory or approach leads to a new or unanswered theoretical question. A manuscript that Robert Sutton edited had strong data, but all three reviewers emphasized that it had weak theory and poorly motivated hypotheses. The author responded to these concerns by writing a new introduction that added citations to many papers containing theory and many terms like psychosocial theory, identity theory, and social comparison theory. But it still contained no discussion of what these theories were about and no discussion of the logical arguments why these theories led to the author's predictions. The result was that this paper contained almost no theory, despite the author's assertion that much had been added. References are sometimes used like a smokescreen to hide the absence of theory. Both of us can think of instances in which we have used a string of references to hide the fact that we really didn't understand the phenomenon in question. This obfuscation can unfortunately be successful when references are made to widely known and cited works. Like Cantor, 1977, Katz and Kahn, 1978, March and Simon, 1958, Thompson, 1967, and Williamson, 1975. Mark Twain defined a classic as a book which people praise but don't read. Papers for organizational research journals typically include a set of such throwaway references. These citations may show that the author is a qualified member of the profession, but they don't demonstrate that a theoretical case has been built. Authors need to explicate which concepts and causal arguments are adopted from cited sources and how they are linked to the theory being developed or tested. This suggestion does not mean that a paper needs to review every nuance of every theory cited. Rather, it means that enough of the pertinent logic from past theoretical work should be included so that the reader can grasp the author's logical arguments. For example, Wick, 1993, 644. Acknowledged his conceptual debt to Perrow's work and presented the aspects he needed to maintain logical flow in this sentence from his article on the collapse of sense-making, because there is so little communication within the crew and because it operates largely through obtrusive controls like rules and supervision, Perrow, 1986. It acts more like a large formal group with mediated communication than a small informal group with direct communication. Note how there is no need for the reader to know about or read Perrow's work in order to follow the logic in this sentence. 2. Data are not theory. Much of organizational theory is based on data. Empirical evidence plays an important role in confirming, revising, or discrediting existing theory and in guiding the development of new theory. But observed patterns like beta weights, factor loadings, or consistent statements by informants rarely constitute causal explanations. Kaplan, 1964, asserted that theory and data each play a distinct role in behavioral science research, data describe which empirical patterns were observed, and theory explains why empirical patterns were observed or are expected to be observed. The distinction between the amount and kind of evidence supporting a theory and the theory itself may seem obvious to most readers. Yet in the papers we have reviewed and edited over the years, this is a common source of confusion. We see it in papers by both experienced and inexperienced authors. We also see it in our own papers. Authors try to develop a theoretical foundation by describing empirical findings from past research and then quickly move from this basis to a discussion of the current results, using a series of findings, instead of a blend of findings and logical reasoning. To justify hypotheses is especially common. Empirical results can certainly provide useful support for a theory, but they should not be construed as theory themselves. Prior findings cannot by themselves motivate hypotheses, and the reporting of results cannot substitute for causal reasoning. One of Sutton's early papers tried to motivate 5 hypotheses about the relationship between union effectiveness and union members' well-being with the following paragraph. Recent empirical evidence suggests that the collective bargaining process, Cochin, Lipsky, and Dayer, 1974, Peterson, 1972, the Union Management Contract, Davis and Sullivan, 1980, and Union Management Relations in General, Cook and Fox, 1978, all have important consequences for the quality of work life of unionized workers. Moreover, Hammer, 1978, has investigated the relationship between union strength and construction workers' reactions to their work. She found that union strength, operationalized in terms of workers' relative wages, was positively related to both pay satisfaction and perceived job security. Finally, the union's ability to formally increase members' participation in job-related decisions has been frequently cited as contributing to the unionization of teachers and other professionals, example Bass and Mitchell, 1976, Velasco and Alutto, 1969, Kamat, 1976. Carillon and Sutton, 1982, 172 to 173. There is no attempt in this paragraph to explain the logical reasons why particular findings occurred in the past or why certain empirical relationships are anticipated in the future. We only learn from the paragraph that others had reported certain findings, and so similar patterns would be expected from the data. This is an example of brute empiricism, where hypotheses are motivated by prior data rather than theory. Although our examples focus on using past quantitative data to motivate theory and hypotheses, qualitative papers are not immune to such problems. Quotes from informants or detailed observations may get a bit closer to the underlying causal forces than, say, mean job satisfaction scores or organizational size, but qualitative evidence, by itself, cannot convey causal arguments that are abstract and simple enough to be applied to other settings. Just like theorists who use quantitative data, those who use qualitative data must develop causal arguments to explain why persistent findings have been observed if they wish to write papers. that contain theory, Glaser and Strauss, 1967. In comparing self-managing teams to traditional teams with supervisors, Barker, 1993, 408, quoted an informant, "Now, the whole team is around me and the whole team is observing what I'm doing." This quote doesn't contain causal logic and isn't abstract enough to be generalized to other settings. But these data helped guide and support Barker's inference that because every team member has legitimate authority over every other, and because the surveillance of multiple co-workers is harder to avoid than that of a single boss, self-managing teams constrain members quite powerfully. So, although qualitative data inspired Barker's inferences, they are distinct from his theoretical analysis. Mintzberg, 1979, 584, summarized this distinction succinctly: the data do not generate theory, only researchers do that. 3. Lists of variables or constructs are not theory. Organizations present a numerical index to 206 variables discussed in the classic book. This list of variables and the definitions that March and Simon present of these variables are important parts of their theory but do not, alone, constitute theory. A theory must also explain why variables or constructs come about or why they are connected. Wick, 1989, 517, quoted Homans to make this point. Of particular interest is Homans' irritation with theorists who equate theory with conceptual definitions. He stated that much official sociological theory consists in fact of concepts and their definitions. It provides a dictionary of a language that possesses no sentences. Papers submitted to organizational journals often are written as if well-defined variables or constructs, by themselves, are enough to make theory. Sometimes the list of variables represents a logical attempt to cover all or most of the determinants of a given outcome or process. Such lists may be useful catalogs of variables that can be entered as predictors or controls in multiple regression equations or Lisrel models, but they do not constitute theory. Listing the demographic characteristics of people associated with a given behavior is not theory. Dividing the world into personality versus situational determinants does not, by itself, constitute a theory of behavior. Nor does developing a categorical scheme to cover the determinants of a dependent variable such as escalation, Staw and Ross, 1987, constitute an explanation of that variable. As an empirically based field, organizational research is often enticed by tests showing the relative strength of one set of variables versus others on particular outcomes. We are attracted to procedures that show the most important influence on dependent variables, as though the contest will show who the winner is. Comparative tests of variables should not be confused with comparative tests of theory. However, because a predicted relationship must be explained to provide theory, simply listing a set of antecedents, or even a causal ordering of variables as in Lisrel models, does not make a theoretical argument. Key issue is why a particular set of variables are expected to be strong predictors. 4. Diagrams are not theory. Diagrams or figures can be a valuable part of a research paper but also, by themselves, rarely constitute theory. Probably the least theoretical representations are ones that simply list categories of variables such as personality, environmental determinants, or demographics. More helpful are figures that show causal relationships in a logical ordering, so that readers can see a chain of causation or how a third variable intervenes in or moderates a relationship. Also useful are temporal diagrams showing how a particular process unfolds over time. On occasion, diagrams can be a useful aid in building theory. 4. Researchers who are not good writers, a set of diagrams can provide structure to otherwise rambling or amorphous arguments. For those researchers who are talented writers, having a concrete model may prevent obfuscation of specious or inconsistent arguments. Regardless of their merits, diagrams and figures should be considered as stage props rather than the performance itself. As Whetten, 1989, suggested, while boxes and arrows can add order to a conception by explicitly delineating patterns and causal connections, they rarely explain why the proposed connections will be observed. Some verbal explication is almost always necessary. The logic underlying the portrayed relationships needs to be spelled out. Text about the reasons why a phenomenon occurs, or why it unfolds in a particular manner, is difficult to replace by references to a diagram. A clearly written argument should also preclude the need for the most complicated figures we see in articles, those more closely resembling a complex wiring diagram than a comprehensible theory. Good theory is often representational and verbal. The arguments are clear enough that they can be represented in graphical form, but the arguments are also rich enough that processes have to be described with sentences and paragraphs so as to convey the logical nuances behind the causal arrow. One indication that a strong theory has been proposed is that it is possible to discern conditions in which the major proposition or hypothesis is most and least likely to hold. Pfeffer and Salenseek, 1978, for example, argued that power is a stronger predictor of resource allocations under conditions of uncertainty. House, 1988, likewise, made the case that individuals high in power needs are likely to gain control when organizations are in a state of flux. The reasoning underlying these predictions, even their direction, is not apparent by just showing the existence of moderating variables in a causal diagram. Logical explanations are required. 5. Hypotheses, or predictions, are not theory. Hypotheses can be an important part of a well-crafted conceptual argument. They serve as crucial bridges between theory and data, making explicit how the variables and relationships that follow from a logical argument will be operationalized. But, as Dubin, 1976, 26, noted, a theoretical model is not simply a statement of hypothesis. Hypotheses do not, and should not, contain logical arguments about why empirical relationships are expected to occur. Hypotheses are concise statements about what is expected to occur, not why it is expected to occur. We cannot find a single source that asserts that hypotheses, or other specific predictions, alone constitute theory. As Kaplan, 1964, 350, put it, an explanation rests on a nomological or theoretical generalization, or an intelligible pattern, but a prediction need not have such a basis. We can give a reason for making some specific prediction rather than another, but we may be able to give no reason other than past successes for expecting the reason to come true. Homans, 1964, Merton, 1967, and Wick, 1989, are just a few of the authors who made clear that predictions presented without underlying causal logic do not constitute theory. Although it may seem obvious that a listing of hypotheses cannot substitute for a set of logical explanations, this is exactly what is done in many papers. We have noticed two telltale signs that a paper has presented hypotheses in lieu of theory. First, there may be so many hypotheses that none can be adequately explained or motivated. A second tip-off is when the introduction of a paper ends with a long list of hypotheses, a table of predictions, or a summarizing figure. Often, such lists, tables, or figures are only tenuously linked to causal explanations scattered throughout the introduction. Or there may be no linkage at all. In one extreme but by no means uncommon example, Tetrick and Larocco, 1987, tested 21 hypotheses about job stress without presenting the causal logic for any of these predictions. The 21 hypotheses were portrayed in a figure and not otherwise discussed or even listed in the 5 paragraphs constituting the introduction. Readers were referred to another source for the conceptual logic. Sometimes authors use a long list of hypotheses to spread the risk of empirical research. So much time and effort is invested in research projects that authors naturally want to show something for their labor. They may use a buckshot approach to theory testing, posing a wide range of hypotheses and empirical tests. While this may increase one's publication record, it does not make good theory. Strong theory usually stems from a single or small set of research ideas. Some famous examples have been statements that people are motivated to resolve inconsistencies, Festinger, 1957, that social systems are subject to evolutionary forces, Campbell, 1969, Hannon and Freeman, 1989, and that there can be normal accidents, Perrow, 1984. These assertions were simple, though their implications have been widespread. From such simple theoretical arguments have come a set of interrelated propositions and hypotheses that explicated the logical and empirical implications of each theory. Papers with strong theory thus often start with one or two conceptual statements and build a logically detailed case. They have both simplicity and interconnectedness. What is theory? Theory has not the specific definition because different scholars have different views regarding theory. However, the main concern regarding theory is same. Most of the scholars are agreed that theory is based on some variables. Those have the relationship with each other to find or explain any phenomena. Corley and Joya, 2011. So, it is concluded that the set of statements, which is based on some variables, and these variables have some relationship with each other. The relationship may or may not be the organizational processes or the way of actions to perform specific activities to reach specific outcomes. Joya and Pitri, 1990. Theory does not always remain fixed. It will be developed and matured, or rejected with the passage of time and advancement of knowledge. Furthermore, the acceptance of theory plays the more important role than the development of theory. Corley and Joya, 2011. If the theory is really good, but it will not be accepted by target population, then it is useless. Either theory will accept or to reject it is not important. The main importance of thing is that it should be interested based on facts and figures and must be accepted by the stakeholders. Kaplan, 1964. Theory must be comprehensive based on some specific terms regarding to the field. In a theory, at least one phenomenon must be addressed. It should answer almost all questions regarding theory. The most important thing regarding is that it must be generalized. Corley and Joya, 2011. So, the theory must be rechecked, or it can be do again, which will give the solution of specific phenomena. If the theory cannot be retested, then it will not be admitted as theory. On the other hand, the advancement of knowledge and theory contribution may reject the theory but for specific time period and in specific situation, theory must be retested and prove the same phenomena again and again. Mintzberg, 2005. What is theorizing? Theorizing is the overall process of theory development. All the set of activities which will perform to develop the theory is called theorizing. According to different scholars, theory is the product and the theorizing is the process. Wick, 1995. So, it is the process which will adopt to gain end product of theory. Theorizing process has not a specific process or set of specific actions to achieve theory. Because each theory is unique and the process to develop each theory is also different. So, it is different from theory to theory. Sutton and Staw, 1995. The general theorizing process is based on the abstracting, generalizing, relating, selecting, explaining, synthesizing and idealizing. It is the complete process of theorizing. The theorizing approximation can be divided into four major processes. The first process is to identify a broad framework and develop the broad framework to address the specific phenomena. In this process only, factors and variables have been identified. Wick, 1995. These are major factors that are contributing in the phenomena. But the relationship between these variables has not been identified at this stage. This step only highlights the people and factors or variables and makes the framework in broader sense in this stage. No relationship between variables can be identified at this stage. Bacharach, 1989. The second stage of theorizing process is based on specifying the broader framework into specific sense to address the phenomena. In this stage the concepts or variables are defined and they are more cleared. The definition of variables makes them clearer. Wick, 1995. If some additional variables are taken in the broader framework of first stage, then they are ignored in this stage because the stage give more clear concepts about the phenomena and affecting variables on the phenomena. Still, there is no relationship between the variables have been developed in this stage. So, this stage only gives the definition and clarity about variables instead of making the relationship between variables. Runkel and Runkel, 1984. The third stage of theorizing is to develop the hypothesis. In this stage, post factum interpretation has been given to develop ad hoc hypothesis. This hypothesis development will make a clear relationship between variables on the basis of facts and figures. In this step, the process got more clarity and developed the relationship among variables, but at that stage no any theoretical test has been conducted. Wick, 1995. This stage of theorizing gives the whole clarity about concepts, their relationship, and the set of all activities which will be done during theorizing. Only data collection and hypothesis testing about theory has not done in this stage. So, this stage is the exploratory stage, so, this stage will not explain the phenomena. Staw and Ross, 1978. The last stage of theorizing process is generalization on the basis of empirical results. In this stage of theorizing, everything about theory will be explained properly. Relationship between variables have been defined, and these relationships also tested through hypothesis testing process, and the results of these tests can be interpreted. Wick, 1995. This stage also gives the future predictions about the phenomena. This stage also provides a framework to develop future relationship among variables. Theorizing is totally different from theory. In simple words, theory is the end product and theorizing are the process or set of activities to perform for the achievement of this end product is theory. Wick, 1993. Essential building blocks of theory development. Every theory is different from another theory. So, it is impossible to make a universal building block for each theory. It varies from one theory to the other. However, there are some essential blocks which vary the theory must be addressed. Wetton, 1989. This question will address these major building blocks of theory. There are 4 major building blocks of each theory. These are what, when, how and why. Every theory must answer these 4 questions, or every theory must be based on the answer of these 4 building blocks. Wetton, 1989. What? It is considered the most important building block of every theory. It consists of the variables or concepts which will explain the phenomena. This question will highlight the major factors those are affecting on the phenomena. Wetton, 1989. There are 2 steps in this block. The first step is to choose the right and relevant factors those are affecting on the phenomena. While the other step of this building block is parsimony. In this process, the unrelated factors or low affecting factors on any specific phenomena should be deleted. Dubin, 1976. When? It is the second most important essential block of every theory. The purpose of this element is to create the balance between parsimony and comprehensiveness of the theory. It is really complicated issue for the theorist. Because in this step they also have to remove some additional concepts from theory. Wetton, 1989. These are those concepts or variables which have fulfilled the first essential building block of theory. Because every selected factor does not have the same or high effect on social phenomena. So, it is required to reduce more less affecting or additional elements those have been selected. Here, theorists had to consider that no factor will be deleted, which will reduce the comprehensiveness of theory. So, the balance between comprehensiveness and parsimony should be developed at this stage. Corley and Joya, 2011. How? It is also the most important building block of theory because in this stage causality or the relationship between variables was established. This relationship is based on the operationalization, which means how variables are affecting with each other. Furthermore, this stage will also suggest that process of all interlinked activities to achieve the outcomes for any phenomena. Some scholars also suggest that there must make a diagram based on boxes and arrows to show the variables and the relationship between these variables. Wetton, 1989. This diagram will be more convenient for readers, reviewers, and authors to understand the whole theory, and its all processes in a way as author has established during theory development. The diagram representation of theory also combines both what and how factors of theory. Because the diagram shows the variables which are based on what element and also show the relationship between these variables which address how the element of theory building. Mintzberg, 2005. Why? It establishes the rationale of the theory. It also gives the justification of variables to contributing in the exact phenomena. It is equally important to give the reasoning that why these factors are socially, economically, and psychologically important to resolve the particular problem or phenomena. This building block also established the reason that why this theory is significant and why colleagues and friends will recommend this theory. Wetton, 1989. So, it is the answer of the acceptance of theory by society. It also established the link between empirical and theoretical model. Homans, 1964. Most of general and important questions will be addressed in this theory building block. The building blocks of what and how describe a phenomenon. Only why is the building block which will explain the phenomena. All theory building blocks have their own importance. Every theory will address these basic building blocks of theory. No, any theory will be established without these 5 theory building blocks. What is theoretical contribution? Theoretical contribution is the most important question which will be asked everywhere during discussion or publication. What is your theoretical contribution? Many scholars are misunderstood that theoretical contribution is only the addition or subtraction of variables from theory. However, in actual it is not the theoretical contribution. Corley and Joya, 2011, Dubin, 1976. Theoretical contribution has broader scope. The authors must be addressed that why they add or subtract any variable from existing variables in theory, and how change in the variable will affect on existing theory. So, these questions must be addressed during theoretical contribution. Without answering these questions, no theoretical contribution is considered significant. Wick, 1989. Theoretical contribution is further divided into 2 dimensions. The first dimension is the originality. This dimension of theoretical contribution is also divided into two sub-dimensions. These are incremental and revelatory, Corley and Joya, 2011, Dubin, 1976. The first dimension of originality is incremental. This dimension will explain if some additional variable is added in the existing theory and how the addition of new variable will behave in current phenomena. How the current theory will change through the addition of this new variable. This is the main purpose of incremental contribution, is to show how the new variable will change or improve existing theoretical framework. Glaser, Strauss, and Strutzel, 1968. Revelatory is the second dimension of originality in theoretical contribution. This concept, how the theory will contribute towards the advancement of existing knowledge. Corley and Joya, 2011, Dubin, 1976. It is also considered that theory must reveal the hidden truths related to phenomena, which have not been discovered yet. So, it may be led to new theory development. So, the revelatory plays more important part in theory contribution. Theoretical factors must open the hidden factors related to phenomena. The theory must be interested, and it is not important either theory is accepted or rejected. The important thing is that how much theory is interested for its stakeholders. Festinger, 1962. The second dimension of theoretical contribution is the utility. The utility of theory is the practical implementation of theory. It explains how concepts will be implemented in the organizations or in society. The utilization of theory is also divided into two sub-dimensions. These are scientific utility and practical utilities. Corley and Joya, 2011, Dubin, 1976. The scientific utility is the utility of theory in the other fields of study. How one theory can be implemented in the other fields of study and enhance the theoretical implementation in knowledge. It is also cross-validation of theory in different fields, which will enhance the credibility of theory. Mintzberg, 2005. Practical utility of theory is also the contribution of theory. Because it is the practical implementation of theoretical concepts into organizations and has to find the effect and outcome of these concepts. Corley and Joya, 2011, Dubin, 1976. If the theoretical contribution matches with the practical outcomes of the concepts, then the theory is considered to have a great contribution in social and organizational development. Dubin, 1976. It is concluded that only the addition and subtraction of variables without reasoning and finding the effect are not the theoretical contribution. Editors, reviewers, and readers want to find out the interested outcomes of theories, its utility and originality. All these factors should answer how it affects, or how it explains changing effect, and also explain the reason. Without reasoning, no theoretical contribution will be considered. That is the main reason of rejection of papers, because authors claim it has theoretical contribution, but in reality, paper has not been contributing in theory. Conclusion. This study has highlighted the various aspects of theory building and theory contribution. Different questions have been addressed throughout this study, which will provide a comprehensive guideline for researchers to consider while developing and contributing in theory. These guidelines also reduce the misunderstandings about theory contribution. The implementation of this study during the theory development or contribution will enhance the productivity and chances of publication of theoretical papers in theory-related journals. What theory is not? This presentation describes differences between papers that contain some theory rather than no theory. The re is little. Agreement about what constitutes strong versus weak theory in the social sciences, but there is more. Consensus that references, data, variables, diagrams, and hypotheses are not theory. Despite this consensus, however, authors routinely use these 5 elements in lieu of theory. We explain how each of these 5 elements can be confused with theory and how to avoid such confusion. By making this consensus explicit, we hope to help authors avoid some of the most common and easily averted problems that lead readers to view papers as having inadequate theory. We then discuss how journals might facilitate the publication of stronger theory. We suggest that if the field is serious about producing stronger theory, journals need to reconsider their empirical requirements. We argue that journals ought to be more receptive to papers that test part rather than all of a theory and use illustrative rather than definitive data. The authors, reviewers, readers, and editors who shape what is published in ASQ insist, perhaps above all else, that articles contain strong organizational theory. ASQ's notice to contributors states, if manuscripts contain no theory, their value is suspect. A primary reason, sometimes the primary reason, that reviewers and editors decide not to publish a submitted paper is that it contains inadequate theory. This paper draws on our editorial experiences at ASQ and Research in Organizational Behavior, ROB, to identify some common reasons why papers are viewed as having weak theory. Authors who wish to write strong theory might start by reading the diverse literature that seeks to define theory and distinguish weak from strong theory. The Academy of Management Review published a forum on theory building in October 1989. Detailed descriptions of what theory is and the distinctions between strong and weak theory in the social sciences can be found, for example, in Dubin's 1976 Analysis of Theory Building in Applied Areas, Friese's 1980 Review of Formal Theorizing, Kaplan's 1964 Philosophical Inquiry into the Behavioral Sciences, Mertens, 1967, Writings on Theoretical Sociology, and Wicks, 1989, Ideas about Theory Construction as Disciplined Imagination. Unfortunately, the literature on theory building can leave a reader more rather than less confused about how to write a paper that contains strong theory, Friese, 1980. There is lack of agreement about whether a model and a theory can be distinguished, whether a typology is properly labeled a theory or not, whether the strength of a theory depends on how interesting it is, and whether falsifiability is a prerequisite for the very existence of a theory. As Merton 1967-39 put it, like so many words that are bandied about, the word theory threatens to become meaningless, because its referents are so diverse, including everything from minor working hypotheses through comprehensive but vague and unadhered speculations, to axiomatic systems of thought. Use of the word often obscures, rather than creates understanding. Lack of consensus on exactly what theory is may explain why it is so difficult to develop strong theory in the behavioral sciences. Reviewers, editors, and other audiences may hold inconsistent beliefs about what constitutes theory, and what constitutes strong versus weak theory. Aspiring organizational theorists face further obstacles because there is little consensus about which theoretical perspectives, and associated jargon, are best suited for describing organizations and their members. Pfeffer, 1993. Even when a paper contains a well-articulated theory that fits the data, editors or reviewers may reject it or insist the theory be replaced simply because it clashes with their particular conceptual tastes. Finally, the process of building theory is itself full of internal conflicts and contradictions.